I've been thinking a lot about ruins lately, and as part of an effort to bridge this newer channel with my other channel, which mostly focuses on Lord of the Rings modifications for various games, I wanted to begin by talking about a particular scene in The Two Towers. This is the section in the chapter called The Road to Isengard, where we get an image of Gandalf, Theoden, and the rest of the company crossing the fords of Isen and moving north along what's left of the river. On this path, they traverse what is called an ancient highway. They arrive at a mysterious column, and then ultimately they arrive at Isengard itself, the ring of which is, of course, destroyed and in complete ruin thanks to the attention of the Ents. Inside the ring of Isengard, the entire area is flooded. The center, which of course is the pillar, the Tower of Orthanc itself, is surrounded by water. So we have this strong image of destruction, really an image of ruin. This is an image that one could argue could have come to Tolkien almost subconsciously, almost by osmosis, through his reading and his living with and in the Anglo-Saxon literature of which he was so fond. And there's a particular piece that I want to discuss today of Anglo-Saxon poetry, a rather long poem, about the same length as Beowulf, called Andreas. This is a story of the Apostle Andrew, one of the 12 disciples of Christ. It is an apocryphal story. It does not appear in any biblical literature that I'm aware of, but it is a story that made the rounds in the early medieval period. We have several other versions of a story very similar to the Anglo-Saxon poem. There is a Greek version, the Acts of Andrew, I believe. We also have, I think it's something like the Acts of Andrew in the City of the Cannibals is the Greek title of the legend. There's also a Latin version called the Cassanetensis, I believe. And there is an Old English prose homily which tells the story in a shorter form. But there is, of course, the poem itself, the longer poem Andreas. Andreas is an interesting poem to me, in part because you don't hear about it very much. If you're familiar with Anglo-Saxon literature, you are familiar, of course, with Beowulf, right? That is the pinnacle of Old English literature in many ways. But you're also maybe familiar with poems like The Ruin or The Wanderer. Both poems which incidentally describe ruins in a very similar way to what we will be talking about today. And both poems of which also feature the enigmatic phrase Enta Yewerk, which could be translated as the work of giants. But Andreas stands apart from those poems. For one, being a biblical story, an apocryphal biblical story, it's not something that I think appealed to many 20th century critics who were largely secular, and we could argue more interested in maybe the more universal appeal of poems like The Wanderer or The Ruin. Andreas also has suffered with some comparisons to Beowulf. We are quite sure that Andreas came after Beowulf, and many scholars have written about the connections between the two poems. There are some turns of phrase that are essentially taken from Beowulf and used again in Andreas, which is something that occurs throughout a lot of Old English literature generally. But in the case of Andreas, these turns of phrase seem a bit odd to modern readers. When you read about the saintly Apostle Andrew being described as a thane and having his warriors, his retainers about him, the martial imagery, the warlike language that is used seems incongruous with what we would expect. There is briefly a bit of a cottage industry, it seems, in criticism of Andreas and sort of denigrating it on those terms, that it ineptly used some of the imagery and phraseology of the much better poem Beowulf. As with most critical fads or traditions, the pendulum swings. And so I would argue that maybe in the past few decades we've seen a bit of a renaissance of the old poem. There is a fantastic edition of Andreas that you can find. North and Bentley are the two editors. I think it's Richard North and Michael Bentley. Maybe those first names are transposed, but regardless, the North and Bentley edition features a wonderful in-depth introduction. It also features the edition of the poem in the Old English language with a facing page translation, many footnotes and commentaries, and it's a very elucidating read. And over the years of thinking about Old English ruin and these mysterious figures, the Ents of the phrase "enta your work," Andreas has come up and has actually taken central stage for me in my thinking about those terms. So let's keep the image of Isengard in our mind, especially the ruined Isengard after the Ents have destroyed it, while we take a look at Andreas. And what I intend to do here is just to briefly retell the story and talk a bit about why I find it interesting in the context of Tolkien's writing. The action of Andreas takes place after the ascension of Christ. We're essentially in the period discussed in the biblical book, the Acts of the Apostles, where the various apostles are now wandering over the earth, spreading the word. Andrew is, I believe, in Greece when the poem opens, and he is told that his brother apostle Matthew has gotten himself into trouble and is imprisoned in a place called Myrmidonia. With the mention of Myrmidonia, we are in a legendary landscape now. There is no such place we can identify easily on a map. There could have been a thought in the minds of the author or the various authors of this story that it was located in Scythia, right? But of course, that is a difficult place to identify precisely on a map because very many peoples throughout history were referred to as Scythians. We may think nowadays of the Scythians as those people living, to the north of the Black Sea, but depending on when they were being written about, the Goths could be referred to as Scythians and other peoples as well. But we could imagine that in general, Myrmidonia is a place located somewhere in the east, somewhere far away. Andrew receives the news directly from God that Matthew is in trouble and he has to go save him. And he is, like any good hero, initially very reluctant to do so. He eventually gets convinced, seeks passage on a ship, and over the course of this stormy, very difficult journey, it is revealed to the readers and ultimately, eventually to Andrew after the fact, that the captain of the ship was none other than Christ himself in disguise. It's actually a wonderful scene because the shipman, the captain, is getting Andrew to tell stories about Jesus, and he is Christ himself, right? So he wants Andrew to tell stories about himself. There's something very interesting about that dynamic. Well, Andrew duly does so. He tells these stories, he falls asleep, and then when he wakes up, he's on the beaches in front of Myrmidonia itself, and it becomes clear to him that the captain was none other than Christ. So now, armed with confidence, he is able to go into the city and do what he can to rescue Matthew. This is not only a rescue operation, however. If it were, the poem would be over about halfway through. What Andrew will ultimately do is convert the population of Myrmidonia, except for about 14 of the real hard cases. He will convert them to Christianity. He will make the city and it is a very urban landscape. He will make this into a bishopric. This is going to be a place not only for Christians, but for the instruction of other Christians. And then before he departs, he makes sure that they have everything that they need. That's a very quick retelling of the action, but a few points are interesting. One is that the city itself is described in some detail, which is somewhat unusual. Very little Old English literature dwells on cities, it seems to me, or dwells on urban landscapes. If you've taken a course in Old English literature, there is a lot of discussion of the natural world, especially the harshness of the natural world, right? We get a lot of that imagery in poems like The Wanderer and The Seafarer. Even The Ruin is an example of an urban landscape that has been invaded by nature, or by the will of God, if you will, using nature, using the elements of nature like storms and winds, and the freezing and cracking ice and frost of winter to destroy the things that men have built. Myrmidonia is, however, an urban landscape that is still inhabited, but it is not inhabited by a normal society. It is sort of a topsy-turvy society because these are cannibals. The plan for the imprisoned Matthew and I think several hundred other unfortunates who were held in a prison along with him was to blind them, to poison them over the course of, I think, about a month, and then eat them, essentially. It was this very ordered plan that the Myrmidonian cannibals have. They're not savages, right? They're not simply just tearing apart their victims immediately. They will stock them in the prison, do what they need to do in terms of ritual preparation, and then consume them. That's the plan. So there's a lot of forethought into this. And we learn over the course of the poem that this society of cannibals, in addition to having a certain amount of forethought and planning, is ruled actually by the devil. It's not totally clear whether it's clear to the Myrmidonians that their leader is the devil, or if the devil is sort of taking disguises, appearing as other important men, important leaders among these cannibals. But that is the case. There's a series of several conversations that take place between Andrew and the devil himself. So of this rescue operation, there are two scenes that are particularly important. When Andrew first arrives, he goes down a street, and again, we could remember the highway of Isengard, that ancient highway. The street that Andrew goes down right through the center of Myrmidonia on his way to rescue Matthew and the other prisoners is described as Enta York. So this is another one of those descriptions essentially meaning the work of giants that is applied to Myrmidonia. It's applied to the buildings in The Ruin. It's applied to buildings in The Wanderer. It also appears several times in Beowulf. And it will appear later in this poem as well. So the work of giants, the work of these mysterious Ents, is all through a lot of Old English literature, but it's present here as well. So that highway is not only significant as it is a sort of a way of passage for Andrew through the city, it will also become the instrument of his torture. Because after freeing the prisoners, Andrew himself returns to the city, and he allows himself essentially to become captured, to become imprisoned, and as part of his torture, he is dragged along those streets over the course of 3 or 4 days. That dragging, that very gruesomely described torture, leaves bits of his clothes, his hair, his flesh, his blood to cover those streets, which again had been described as the work of giants. And as part of this torture, Andrew has a moment of weakness, just similar to what we saw in the beginning of the poem, where he feels like he cannot possibly complete this task. In the midst of his tortures, he cries out to God, and he says, you suffered 3 hours on the cross. Here I am suffering for 3 days, right? I thought you said this was going to work out, which it's hard to imagine a more bold claim to make, right? Especially in Andrew's case, he knows Christ, right? Like he spent his years of his life with him, and now he's saying, you only suffered for 3 hours on the cross, right? I've got to suffer 3 days. Why? As part of the response, he is told to look behind him, and there he can see that the streets, the stones covered with his blood, with his hair, with bits of his flesh and his clothes, are actually transformed. They're transformed into fruitful vegetation. Trees are growing, bearing fruit. in the midst of this city. That's significant because the city is not only a city of cannibals, it's a city in which the cannibals are starving after Andrew has freed the prisoners, and it's also something of a ruin itself. The editors, North and Bentley, in the edition I mentioned earlier, go into some wonderful detail about the juxtaposition in the poem between the urban landscapes, the descriptions of walls, roads, towers, and other buildings, and a more natural landscape which seems to be intruding into the city of Myrmidonia. When Andrew is dragged along that street, he's dragged around caves and bluffs and hills, and it's not totally sure where the city ends and this wild natural landscape begins. They're sort of mixed all in together. That juxtaposition between the work of giants, the Enta Uwerk that we see in many other places in Old English literature, alongside natural phenomena such as storms, the winter, frost, and so on, that's a fairly common trope. What's different in Andreas is that apart from those destructive elements of nature, we also see the fruitful work of nature that is provided by God, but also by Andrew's own suffering, right? Like his own passion is what sows the seed for the fruits of Myrmidonia. And as an aside here, if I could take a moment to take up issue with another critic who wrote Political Appetites. The name is Aaron Hostetter, I believe. He's actually done some wonderful work on the internet. You can find his I think it's the Anglo-Saxon Narrative Poetry Project, where he has undertaken at no cost translations of all of the Anglo-Saxon narrative poems. It's a wonderful resource. And he also wrote this book, Political Appetites, in which he discusses Andreas, amongst other things. One of his key points in the poem of Andreas, however, which I do take issue with, is the idea that after Andrew manages to convert the Myrmidonians, they're still starving, because they were starving prior to their conversion, and then they are converted, and Andrew has done nothing to apparently provide food for them, right? They're cannibals. They don't seem to have any agriculture. No food is mentioned. No work is mentioned for the Myrmidonians that would lead to them providing food. And so the poem ends on a happy note for Myrmidonia. Andrew manages to convert them, and the city is transformed into a happy Christian place with references to wealth and wine and things like that. But for Hostetter, this is still a problem because no explicit mention is made of food. So, Andrew may have converted them, but once he leaves, according to Hostetter's reading, the Myrmidonians are going to starve. I disagree with this reading simply because I think it's too much of a materialist reading. If we look at, again, Andrew's passion, right, and the result of that is he has this vision of blossoming groves opening up and unfolding on the streets behind him. We could, I suppose, read that as simply a vision, a sort of a dream vision that he has, but it seems not to be. It seems to be something that he actually sees. And I think we're intended to read that as the beginning of the transformation of this infertile, hostile city into a place that is fertile and life-giving. But let's now talk a bit about how that conversion is effected, because we're seeing Andrew dragged around the city. We're seeing the city begin to transform into these blossoming groves, although the Myrmidonians themselves make no comment about this. So it seems that is not enough to convert them. What does actually convert them? Well, the conversion comes about in a very dramatic way. Andrew is brought back to the prison on the last day of his suffering, and he sees, apparently outside of the prison, some scholars read it as he seeing this inside, within the walls of the prison, but regardless of where it is, he sees a pillar. This is a pillar that is described as Enta Yawerk. This is also a pillar that is described as having been exposed to storms, potentially, and so it seems to be somewhat ruined. Another very interesting aspect of this pillar is that it appears in some of the other versions of the Andrew story where the pillar has a capital, right? The sort of decorative element on the top of the pillar, and not only a capital, but also a statue or a figure of maybe a god or some person on the top of it. What Andrew does in the Old English poem, no capital is mentioned on the pillar here, no figure is mentioned on the pillar. He's addressing the stone itself. He's addressing the stone work of the pillar. And he says, essentially, you are the same kind of stone on which God wrote the Ten Commandments. And what you need to do now is open up and create a flood in this city. And the pillar responds. The pillar doesn't say anything, but it obeys. From beneath its base, this massive flood begins to well up. The city is entirely flooded. And I think 14 of the absolute worst unrepentant Myrmidonians are killed, sort of sucked down into the sort of a hell mouth type of barrow, potentially, that may be in the center of the city, or at least at a prominent location in the city. But as for the rest of the Myrmidonians, they repent, right? They discover that they're not able to withstand this flood, and they realize the power that Andrew is attuned to. So he causes this flood from a pillar which is moreover described as Entish, as Ent work, Enta Yawerk, the work of these giants. And if we can further bring this back to the description of Isengard, of course, you may have been thinking throughout, that word Enta Yawerk is obviously related to the Ents that Tolkien created for the Lord of the Rings. And they are, but it's maybe worth discussing the ways in which Tolkien uses them differently, very differently from the way they appear in Old English literature. So apart from the poetic references to Enta Yawerk, the work of giants, we also have several prose references to Ents as characters, apparently. Some of the most famous would be Nimrod, who is associated with the building of the Tower of Babel from the book of Genesis. The Babel story, of course, is the idea that all the peoples of the world got together and they decided, let's build a tower up to heaven, and then we will be unstoppable. And then God looks down and says, yeah, they're going to be unstoppable if they build this tower up to heaven, so let's go down and destroy the work and separate them out. That being done, the fall of Babel is associated with linguistic diversity, because from that event, the speech of all the different peoples of the world was divided, was sundered one from another, so that they could no longer all work together to create such a threatening or arrogant kind of work. So Nimrod is associated with this in the writings of Alfric and in various other medieval commentators. He's not actually said to be that builder in the Bible, I believe, but medieval understandings of that would associate with him with that work. And he is said to be an Ent in the works of Alfric, which is interesting because in the Bible, Nimrod is just a guy, right? He is just a man. We do in the Bible also get mentions of giants. I believe it's Genesis chapter 6, verse 4, where you can read about giants being on the earth in those days, being essentially the offspring of these sons of God who mated with the human women who were on the earth at this time. And so giants and other mighty men are sort of the result of those unions. And this became a trope that was picked up by other medieval commentators through the centuries and was used to explain all sorts of things, including monsters and other types of unsavory figures. Ent is the word that is used in Genesis 6:4 translations in Old English. So we see the idea that on the one hand, These Entish figures are just evidently human or very close to human, but they also represent something that's a little different, maybe a little above human, maybe beyond the ability that humans possess. That idea of the skill of the Ents is borne out in the description of the works that they have created. For although those works are most often seen in ruin, in fragmentary pieces, they are nevertheless somehow admired for the at least partial survival that they have achieved over the years. So there has emerged this view of the Ents as, to the Anglo-Saxons anyway, as being understood as being good craftsmen, right? Like great workers in stone, maybe great workers in metal, although I would argue that point. But regardless, as being skilled workers of some great works that maybe men can no longer attain. But they are also nevertheless associated with men. We're not to imagine these gigantic monsters, I think, when we imagine Ents. So let's now look at Tolkien's Ents. They are not representatives of the pride and folly of men or of the sort of inadvised union of sons of God, whatever that means, with human women on the earth. The Ents in Tolkien have a very different union, although it occurs to me now that their origin story is itself not unproblematic. If we can see in the Silmarillion that the Ents were sort of given to Yavanna as a sort of a consolation prize for the dwarves, right, that Aiul had created on his own. So the Ents are imagined as the shepherds of the trees, right, the herdsmen of the trees to protect the forests and the plant life, the growing things that cannot move about and defend themselves from the depredations of the other species who can use them for firewood. As Aule says in that wonderful last line, no doubt they will have need of firewood. He's talking about the dwarves. Regardless, the Ents in Tolkien do seem to represent a natural force, which is very different from how they are used in Old English, where they are somewhat representative of the old works of man. And I'm still wrapping my head around this a bit, but the idea that the destruction of Isengard was effected by Ents in Tolkien seems somehow to fit very well, but also somewhat uncomfortably with the idea of the destruction of Myrmidonia, which itself was already destroyed. We might call it the cleansing of Myrmidonia then, and maybe the rebirth of Myrmidonia affected by an Entish object. Right, so there's something that's very nice about the correspondence there between those two stories. The Pillar of Orthanc is not said to be worked by giants or Ents, of course, in Tolkien, but there is a bit of ambiguity with its origin. I think we are intended to suppose that this was made by Númenórean craft. In the relevant chapter, though, I don't think the Númenóreans are referenced, at least in that chapter, The Road to Isengard, as the actual creators. It says something like, in ancient days, the ancient builders had made it, even though it looked like it was maybe a natural result of the convulsions of the earth. So Orthanc is intended to be this very strange-looking pillar, this massive tower, so almost looking as though it is undressed stone. And of course, the Ents themselves are powerless to achieve much against that, except for hurting themselves and maybe a few scratches. But they nevertheless completely flood and destroy the ring of Isengard and all of the outworks. But overall, the message is somewhat the same. We see that the Enta Uwerk of Old English poetry is very often used as a stand-in for ancient power and the dangers maybe of placing too much hope in the works of this world. In The Wanderer, the discussion of the Enta Uwerk is followed by a discussion of essentially the end of the world and the futility of placing your hopes in the material, the here and the now. Because as you can see, these wonderful stone works that once were the home of these great armies, these mighty kings, this joy, this festivity, this companionship, it's all gone. And, I, as this lonely exile cast out upon the sea, suffering the winter, the storms, and all of this hardship, all I have is the memory and the brief sort of echo of that great power before me, and it's ultimately going to crumble, right? And so the Ents in Tolkien are doing the same kind of work, I suppose. Orthanc appears in close proximity to our phrase "Enta Uwerk," actually, in the Old English poem that is called Maxims 2. Right at the beginning, there's a discussion of how it's proper for a king to hold a kingdom and a fortress that can be widely seen, the work of giants, or Orthanc Enta Uwerk, which means something like the skillful work of giants, or the skilled, the clever work of giants. So Orthanc does have that meaning of clever or skillful or skilled. And in Tolkien's rendering, of course, he uses that meaning. He essentially, for the Rohirrim, uses a lot of Old English terms. Orthanc is one of them. But he also points out that this has a double meaning. That in his world, it means cunning mind, which is a bit of a departure from the Old English version, but very cool sounding. Cunning mind is one meaning of the word Orthanc. That's in the language of the Mark, very close to the Old English. But the other meaning, presumably Sindarin, means, I think, forked mountain, something like that, or fork. So that also represents the structure of the tower itself, with those 4 points sort of at the top. And Orthanc and Isengard in Tolkien's writings are sort of another layer of the world, right? The men of Rohan don't fully understand what's going on at Orthanc, right? When we ride up with Gandalf and Theoden into the Wizard's Vale, it is a very mysterious, confusing journey. Not only do we have the fact that we don't know what we're walking into, but there is this mysterious passage of I think it's the Warns, who move alongside the company at night, sort of in this dark mist that they've conjured up to obscure themselves. We have the fact that the stream of the Isen seems to have run dry, and then there's this fog that sort of settles over everything. It's a very mysterious and unknowable place, and not only for these reasons, but also for the simple fact that it's ancient to the Rohirrim, who have been in Rohan for 500 years, and Orthanc was ancient when they arrived. It is a place that had almost been forgotten by the men of Gondor, to whom it had been, one of their fortresses, their outposts, and of course the location of one of the Palantiri for a couple thousand years at that point. So Orthanc represents this kind of power in decline, this height of achievement that is mysterious. We don't know exactly how this tower was built. And there's a wizard there. He's got this skill, but it's something that we can't replicate ourselves as just the regular characters. Like from Merry and Pippin's perspective, even from Theoden and from Eomer's perspective, this is all just almost unknowable. Even from Aragorn's perspective, I would argue, from the perspective of people of Gondor, even like Denethor, Orthanc would hold a lot of secrets and a lot of mystery. And not only because Saruman had been involved, because for thousands of years before Saruman arrived, Orthanc had stood. And of course, with Saruman, it had become essentially corrupted, but it had been in decline even before his arrival. There are various accounts in Appendix A of the fall of the Ring of Isengard to these lesser men, right? These Dunlendings, or other people who were somewhat responsible for the guardianship of Orthanc, who threw in with their enemies. So there are various moments in which we can see that Orthanc, that Isengard, although it's the representative and the inheritor of this ancient wisdom and cunning and craft, when Saruman gets there and when he begins his own decline, it represents this kind of sick old power, which we do see associated with the Enta Uwerk of Old English poetry. And so, again, there's this kind of irony that I can detect in Tolkien's use of Ents as the instrument by which this somewhat Entish structure is ultimately cleansed. And what replaces it, right? What replaces the Ring of Isengard? Not buildings, not towers, not streets paved with gold like we see in Andreas, but groves. We have the tree garth of Orthanc to supplant the stone work of the Ring of Isengard itself. Just like the blossoming groves, the fruit-bearing trees that sprang up in the blood and the hair and the cloth and the flesh that the saint, the holy man, dragged through those streets, through those Entish streets, left behind. As you can see, there's a lot to grapple with here, a lot to unpack, as they say. And I'm just, in some ways beginning my thoughts on this, but I wanted to share those thoughts such as they were with all of you. And I'd be very curious to see if any of you are familiar with any of the scholarship on this, because I haven't seen anything. I haven't searched too thoroughly for it to see if anyone in the Tolkien scholarship circles has written anything about Orthanc, about Ents, about how it might be associated with various Old English poems. The connections are not hard to make, so it would surprise me indeed if no one had made those connections before, but I'd love to read more about it. So thanks again for listening, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care until then.